Well, hello there, and welcome to a special edition of Telile's Roundtable. I'm your host, Adam Cook. This week, we're devoting much of our time to the Richmond County Municipal Boundary Review that's been taking place over the last few months. And specifically, we're going to look at what proposal Richmond Council is going to submit to the Nova Scotia and Utility and Review Board before a deadline set by the board on February the 15th. Now, at its heart, the series Roundtable is all about people getting the chance to talk to one another about the issues that concern them. And that's been happening quite a bit, with 5 open houses on the Municipal Boundary Review taking place in communities all across the county over the past month. I got the chance to visit the last of these open houses, co-hosted by Isle Madame councillors Michael Diggdon and Shawn Samson at Centre La Picasse in Petit de Grat. That took place on January the 21st, and you're going to see some highlights from that in just a few moments. But first of all, here is Warden Amanda Mumbercat at the latest regular monthly meeting of Council taking place just a few nights ago on Monday, January 23rd. Warden Mumbercat is going to set the table for how we got here, what exactly has happened in terms of the process of reviewing Richmond County's municipal boundaries, and what options are on the table for Council to consider. We begin our special coverage of the Richmond Municipal Boundary question on Roundtable this week with Warden Amanda Mumbercat.
I guess the first question we've been answering at some of these information sessions lately and have been since the process started back in June, I think, of last year is why are we doing this? And it is that the Municipal Government Act requires municipalities to review council size and district boundaries every 8 years. So the last one was done in 2014, and our time was 2022 to start a new one. So it was not initiated by council. It was a requirement of the provincial government. It is again kind of a 1-2 punch. I've been telling people: number one, to figure out the number of councillors that should be representing the municipality, and also to look at the boundaries of the various districts within the municipality. Very specific to that scope. Other questions really are not part of this study, something we can entertain at a later date though, for sure. Just wanted to give a quick summary of the 5 criteria that the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board will be reviewing when making their decision. So we will submit a report to the UARB, they will make a final decision, and it is that voter parity is within 10% plus or minus of average of all districts. There are communities of interest, recognizing distinct communities, maintaining their integrity, population and area, so where there's high density or large territories, taking that into consideration. Contiguity, so districts should generally be connected, and strong recognizable boundaries. So at this point in time, I know there have been many in-person sessions so far. We've had I think 6 in the last number of weeks alone. There have been 3 surveys put out. The first focused on council size. The second survey focusing on geography did have an error in it, and I think councillors, we discussed that before Christmas and was a big part of the reason that we wanted to get an extension. So we've had our deadline extended from the end of December 2022 to February 15th, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2023. And with that extension, we did issue another survey, which very recently closed. And I think, wanted to recognize to members of the public who have been asking that I think, we could have probably done a better job on the communications early on around this, and something that we'll absolutely kind of take note of in the future going forward. I know that each of us has had conversations in our communities at this point and with residents about, about what the impacts will potentially be. Communities being split has been a big part of the discussion. I think we need to recognize that that's what happens when we draw, I don't want to say imaginary lines, but we draw lines around communities. There's always going to be some kind of interruption of the natural flow of people. So I think that's why it's so important for us to be, have diverse opinions at the table and make decisions in the best interest of the county. Our population has been declining pretty steadily. It has leveled off, I believe, in the last census, but not projected to really increase. Province-wide, the UARB has been taking an approach of reducing council sizes over the last number of years. They do have the final decision, and that's what we need to consider. And so any report or recommendation that we would forward to UARB, I think we need to be really strong in our rationale as to why we're going in a certain direction. And there had been some talk about it, adding new councillors and what that might cost. And there's no question there would be, in today's world, at the current rates of, stipends and laptops and travel and all of that, there would be an increase should we increase council size, or a decrease should we decrease council size. So that's kind of how that would work. And we do have right now a draft report, I believe, submitted to us by Stantec. There's still markups in it, so it doesn't appear to be finalized, which I know I have some questions on, and we can kind of discuss if we want to ask those questions here or how we want to proceed with that. And I guess at this point, I wanted to, maybe summarize some of the comments that I had heard in the various information sessions, and would ask councillors to jump in, or if you had conversations in community with individuals. Like I've heard comments just such as every penny of tax rate quickly adds up to $1 and people are really struggling. Voter parity is important, but there are extenuating geographical circumstances with Almadam, with sparse populations in the east and also population density in St. Peter's. There were some comments around keeping areas of water and sewer infrastructure together. There were comments around keeping areas around sort of commercial centers together, like the Village or Arishat, and how Richmond County has seen in the last review dramatic change, for a reduction from 10 to 5 councillors, and voters are still getting used to the new districts, but also to a different governance style, because that's what it has meant, and maybe more time is needed to adjust. So I heard all kinds of those types of comments. It is a prescribed process, like I said, that 1, 2, and part of the target is that plus or minus 10%, and our current situation does not meet that target. So I think it's reasonable that we would have gone down a road to look at what voter parity does look like, but I think you're also right, on the other hand, a lesson learned that we need to be right-sizing the process for Richmond County, I guess is what I would say. So, great point.
Yeah, and I guess what I'd say to that, right, is that, the UARB does allow people to go outside of that
Right.
plus or minus 10 with good reason, and I think that, to Councillor Diggdon's point, that would have been sort of an appropriate comment piece, right? Like, do you think we should do the status quo even though we're not within that range
Right.
that they're suggesting? And if so, provide your reasoning why. Because I think that's, that could be quite important as we move forward.
Really, we have, I think, 5 options ahead of us. We can recommend no change to the existing 5 districts. If we do that, we would have an issue with voter parity, which we would have to provide a rationale for. We could recommend the proposed 5 districts as presented, although we do see an issue there with District 2 and 3 and how it kind of veers on to the mainland. Option 3 is we could recommend the proposed 7 districts as presented, although of course, as mentioned, there would be an issue with increased costs. Again, you still have that sort of split communities when, especially at I guess it would be districts 3 and 4 kind of area. Option 4 is we could recommend, for the 5 districts with slight tweaks to the status quo, to the proposed, or to the 7. And then option 5 would be to recommend something completely different, which I think, I don't know that I would recommend that, but those are essentially the options that are ahead of us at this point in the games.
Reading through the report over the weekend, and some of it was a lot of information we had been provided with earlier as well. It gave me a lot of pause to think. Honestly, I prefer the idea of 7, just based on, I think it'd be better representation. I do understand there'd be a cost, however, there could be ways around that, whether the stipends would be reduced if we were to go to 7 as well. That being said, I think it probably is, reasonable that a lot of people shifted their thinking to 5 based on the mapping that was there, and not necessarily being as happy with the mapping when the original map of 7 that had an error in it. They may have liked that, but at the end of the day, we can't go with that. That didn't make any sense. I'd be willing to support going with 5, although I think we should try and get within the voter parity where possible. I believe that's, that's where the UARB would like us to go, and it may be easier for us to set this than to end up with a situation like last time, whereas the decision of council was rejected and then sort of forced upon them. But I'm open to other options as well. I think what you mentioned about option 5 of something completely new, at this point, that'd be the only one I'd feel is off the table.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be in favor of that at all. Outside of that, I'm
Okay,
willing to consider a few options.
awesome. Thank you, Deputy Warden.
So I'll just sort of give a little bit of a history, sort of my thought process, and I shared it with the people at the info session that we hosted weekend before last. Originally my thought was 7 as well, and the original 7 maps seemed to look good to me in terms of, keeping communities of interest together. But then when they were changed, and then we thought a little more about the money part of it, and again, to Deputy Warden's point, we could reduce the stipend, we could keep the envelope of money for council the same and divide it over 7 instead of 5. And that can happen. I don't know how popular that would be, but, it definitely could happen. But I've certainly come around to the idea of 5, and the last survey, the third survey, absolutely supports 5, a decision of 5. I mean, the draft doesn't really give us a real recommendation, so I think that's probably important for folks in the public to know, is that typically Stantec would give a recommendation, and although it's in draft form, their recommendation is kind of, we can't find anything that's conclusive here, and so you folks can decide what you think makes sense. What I heard at the information session, what I've heard from people, is that they're happy with 5, and that they've had a really big change when we went from 10 to 5. And although it's been 8 years, it's only been 8 years, right? Is that they're still getting accustomed to what district they belong to. And I said it from the very beginning when we first looked at the map of 5, that I was not, I did not think it was a good idea to separate parts of the main, to separate out Whiteside and Evanston from the rest of that area in particular. So even if that area was grouped together, but outside of the district, maybe I'd feel differently, but they're really left on their own there. And I think, although it does put us out of the 10%, I think if you talk about communities of interest being together, they need to be in that area of interest. So my suggestion, what I would sort of support is I would support the status quo with some tweaks. And in terms of, the District 3 that I represent, one of the tweaks I certainly see, it was supported by every single survey, people saying the same message, which was that Lennox Passage belonged in District 3. And so, of course, I'm a numbers person, so I do recognize that, currently District 2 in its current format is already, at a minus 13.5%, and if I would take the 38 people that are surveyed that are in that area out, they're going to be a minus 16. And if I would add them into the District 3, which is already over, I'm going to be, that District 3 would be over by 13. But I do, again, when we're talking about percentages, that's important, but if we're talking about number of people, it doesn't feel as heavy as the percentage. So, you're literally talking about very few people in the difference that would bring us to that parity. And I think that the harm that it would cause in terms of people identifying with the councillor or the councillor identifying with the area is greater than that difference. So I think there's also been like a little conversation that one of the things that could happen would be, like, again, I'll just talk District 3 because that's my, the area I represent, would be, like St. George's Channel. If that went into District 4, that could bring District 3 into some line. I'm not really supportive of that either. I'm open to any conversation, but again, I feel like if we look at areas of interest, I feel like they really identify themselves with the folks in the Dundee area and West Bay area. Go to the AGM for St. George's Channel Hall. That's the people that I see in that. It's certainly people from the points in West Bay as well, but I do see those folks there. So my thought would be stick with 5. The tweaks I would propose in my own area would be to include Lennox Passage, period.
Among the issues Richmond councillors hope to resolve with this particular municipal boundary presentation to the UARB is the division of some Richmond County communities in the first set of 5 districts set out in 2016. These include Arishat. We'll get to that particular community in just a couple of minutes when you see highlights from the open house on municipal boundaries hosted at Centre La Picasse in Petit de Grat by Isle-Madame councillors Michael Diggdon and Shawn Samson. But first, you're going to hear from District 3 Councillor Melanie Samson and District 5 Councillor Brent Samson about another community that was split up during the original boundary discussions in 2016, Grande-Greve, which is partly in Deputy Warden Samson's District 5 and partly in Warden Amanda Mumberket's District 4.
Because the only way to make that work would be the whole community would be in 5, not in 4.
I think so.
That would put 4 and 5 both within 10.
And and I get that, and I think the only issue to have that with that in 5 is because 5 geographically is over 50% of the county as it is.
Exactly.
So if there was ever a case to
Yeah.
be made for one to be smaller, although in reality it was almost dead on to parity, it was within 1 or 2% as it was.
Yeah.
I don't know that, whoever it would be in the future representing it, I don't know that it would be a great idea to continue to add to it. For 2 reasons. One, Grande-Greve is really close to St. Peter's and identifies probably more with St. Peter's. And also, the second part of that is just based on the fact that the current map now, I believe it's 50.9% of the county geographically is in District 5.
Yeah.
So just over half.
My suggestion is that we would make a tweak to the status quo as well, for a lot of the reasons Councillor Melanie Samson has talked about, and that it was such a big change in 2014. Those changes, I think, are starting to foster some big picture thinking and maybe a little less sort of in my backyard parochialism kind of thinking, and hoping that we could keep on that track until the population hopefully might warrant additional councillors or representatives in the region. My suggestion is also to return Lennox Passage to District 3. I think you make a good argument there, or rationale there, Councillor Melanie. My thought was, is there a change that we could be doing in Almadam with 2 councillors specifically for Almadam, where we would kind of get a little bit more of an even split between the 2 councillors on the island.
And now, as promised, here is some footage from the last of the municipal councillors' open houses on Richmond County's municipal boundary review. It took place Saturday afternoon, January the 21st, at Centre La Picasse in Petit de Grat, and it was co-hosted by District 1 Councillor Shawn Samson and District 2 Councillor Michael Diggdon. Here are some highlights from that discussion.
The first survey that was online, it had from 1 district up to 10 districts. So people could vote on any number of districts they were looking for or were in favor of. Unfortunately, when the first 2 surveys were done, there was a discrepancy in proposed 7 to the point where the numbers wasn't working. So we had a special meeting. We discussed what we'd like to put on the 3rd survey, and what you see here today is the proposed 5, proposed 7. What you have in your hands there is the 2 options that were on the 3rd survey, and the survey was closed on the 15th, last Sunday, and the results are in. So here's what you have here. So this is the proposed 5. That's the proposed 5. This is the current 5. We have to be in a plus or minus 10 of electoral voters average, and it's, right now we're at 7,582 voters, and we're 5 councillors. So the average is 1,516 voters per. So when it comes to the plus or minus 10%, I'm at a minus 9.5, which I'm in the area I gotta be in, the range. Councillor Diggdon here is at minus 13.4. District 3 is at 10.4, so she's right on the bubble of minus or plus 10%. District 4, Warden Amanda Mumberket is at 11.8. And District 5, Brent Samson, our Deputy Warden, at 0.7, so he's right in line. So this current situation is very close to what has to happen here.
Shawn's District 1, his district is already in parity. District 3 is right on the bubble of 10.4, so it's not really in question. District 4 and 5 will fix themselves. The only one will be out will be District 2 currently. The only way to fix the numbers. Now, there's 4 or 5 different scenarios. Numbers are only one of them. Community engagement is another, community involvement, your centers, everything comes together by trying to join Whiteside, Evanston, Walkerville, as you see in the proposed 5, is that you no longer have that community involvement or engagement. When you look at just Whiteside alone from Lennox Passage, you're probably a 5-kilometer spread of no houses in between. It's pretty hard to maintain a community bond when you got that sort of spread. So, in saying that, I think by just tweaking these numbers a little bit, we're going to send this back off to Stantec, which is the company that the consultants that we have that's going to present this to the UARB board. Again, it's not something that we have an option to want to do or not want to do. Every 8 years it has to be done.
Councillor Diggdon here is out at minus 13.4, but when it comes to the average, I'm okay at 1,373 voters. And Councillor Diggdon is at 1,313. So are we really going to change the way we're doing things and change all this around for probably 60 voters? Because if he had 1,373 like I do, he'd be at a plus or minus 10%. So
that's the existing one,
this is what's going on today. That's right. Yeah.
with no changes.
With no changes, that's right. Yeah. So you got Councillor Diggdon at 1,313, but he's out, of the plus or minus 10% range, and I'm at minus 9.5, so I'm in it. But we're only talking a difference of 60 voters. And when you talk about people moving in, people moving out, whatever, these are numbers that are not current. They're from the past census, correct?
Yeah.
Right. So this.
However, they're the same numbers are used right across the province.
Yeah.
So current or not current, everybody's using the last census number, so that's what we have to go by.
Right. So if this was current today, this would be 1,400 instead of 1,313, right? And he'd be in parity again, right? So our argument right now is why have a councillor. We're looking at proposed 5 right now. We're looking at a councillor that would do the north side of the island, so Jammer's Island, Rocky Bay, the schools, all those areas, and then move on to the mainland to do Whiteside, Low River, Evanston, right? So some people are concerned about that. They're like, well, now you're talking about having 2 councillors on the island, and with this new proposed 5, there could end up being just 1 councillor on the island. Because if someone here wants to run, which they have every right to do so, on the mainland, and they win that area, now they're representing the north side. They're representing the schools, Rocky Bay, Jammers Island, and we're down to 1 councillor on the island instead of 2. Right? So that's the argument about the community split and dividing the island to the mainland. And again, it has nothing to do with us not wanting to support the mainland. We do every time. Every time we have a meeting, we discuss things around the table. We support all of Richmond County. But people are just like, concerned about that community division.
The reason you see 5 and 7 is because when the survey went out from, like Shawn said, from 3 to 10, the most popular that come back was 5 councillors and 7 councillors. So what we did as council is we sent back 5 and 7 to see what the mistake we made is that we didn't say 5, 7 or maintain status quo. And honestly, that should have been part of the survey process to find out. That's why we're holding these public consultations, to find out what everybody's thought is. So far, we've, Jammer's Island, the schools, Irish Head, I believe, Grand Aunts, everything so far has come back, maintain status quo. Leave it at that. We've had a lot that wanted 7 councillors until they actually realized the way the divide was going to happen. And then just for looking at it, you got Poirierville get separated from the schools, Rocky Bay get separated from the schools, so there becomes a 3rd councillor potentially in this area. West Erie-Shed, Jammers Island get separated as districts, and then again you have Lower River, Whiteside, Evanston, Point Up or Port Malcolm become part of this district out here. So the issue that I had with that again was, regardless if you have a councillor that's on the island representing off the island or off the island representing on the island, you're going to feel that you don't have somebody there in your community representing you. And that's the unfortunate part, but that is what the split of 7 is going to potentially do.
So when it came to what's on the survey today, like Councillor Diggdon mentioned, you had proposed 5, proposed 7. Both options have community division, right? So here, you know, we discussed, we had a special meeting and we discussed for close to 3 hours, or 3.5 hours, we discussed the fact that we didn't want any community division. We didn't want, you know, there was talk about Ayrshire being divided. So right now, the current status quo has our districts splitting right at the New Horizon Senior Club. So from the New Horizon East, that's my territory, from the New Horizon outwards, that's my territory. And people were like, you know, well, maybe you want to put all of Ayrshire with District 1, which would have left Mike, which would have left me in proposed 5 with 1,543 voters, because I would have took 170 from Mike. So 170 for the New Horizon to Babins Hill would have been in District 1, and that's why he would have had to make up the extra 170 somewhere to get him within range, and that's what had him going towards the mainland, right? So we argued that point, and we had open discussions on that point of 5 being like that, and not, you know, not dividing Ayrshire. But then we're going to propose 7, and it had us dividing Ayrshire twice. So proposed 7 would have District 1 at the intersection of Highway 206 and 320, right where Sullivan's Fuels is at. So that intersection coming east towards Petit de Grat would have been District 1, and then there would have been another district from that intersection going to West Ayrshire. So we didn't want to split Ayrshire at all, keep Councillor Diggdon where he was. Here we want to split Ayrshire and move him onto the mainland. And here we want to split Ayrshire twice and move the 3rd councillor to the mainland, right? So once the survey, once we had these open discussions and these seminars, the people that filled out the survey said 7, but never made no comments. People that said 5, put 5, and never made no comments. So when we had these open seminars, people that said 7 said they wanted more representation, but they didn't want any community division. And they didn't want the cost of 2 extra councillors. Right? So the cost of 2 extra councillors today, Councillor Diggdon had asked our CFO what those numbers were.
Yeah, so we were up into the 40 plus per councillor, 40,000, and then and what that is the it's the stipend, it's the travel, it's motels, it's everything that, you know, it's your computer, your laptop, your printer. Yep. So and part of that, you know, part of that I can say on behalf and I say it everywhere just so people know. Personally, I don't put in for travel. Personally, I know that Shawn doesn't put in for travel. However, we don't expect the other councillors not to put in for travel. We just because we don't do it, you know, it's there. It's you know, I make the joke, and she's here again today. And I only say that, you know, the warden couldn't drive a car that was ran by batteries and not put in for travel because she's on the road so many times. It's just, you know, some have to and some don't. At this current time, Councillor Shawn and myself don't. So, or I personally don't have to, and you know, he's on the road 7 days a week anyway. So we don't feel the need to put in for travel. It's one less expense that we take back from the.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had a community consultation in Ayrshire, and we had one gentleman, actually, which was great. He showed up and he had made a comment that he would like to see Ayrshire all in just one district. You know, and then when we explained to him how it could potentially mean that District 2 ends up being with the councillor off the island, he changed it really quick. And we also went on to say, you know, I get calls from, you know, Ayrshire, Petit de Grat, you know, east of my district now that I answer, that I respond to, and that I fix the problem. And, you know, Councillor Samson gets some in my area, and the warden gets some from everybody. So it's, but just in saying that, you know, I feel that we cover the island well, and we cover, you know, I got a call from Louisville today, and I got one from St. Peter's. You answer the call as councillors, that's our job. We're here for the County of Richmond. In saying that you know, the least amount of community separation we can have is better for all communities.
So I do the Palmville stretch, but I won't do the South Palmville lane. And this call came from there, and I said, you know, Councillor Diggdon is your councillor, but I do have some of the forms you're looking for. I dropped them off too. Like Councillor Diggdon said, I don't see myself as a councillor for District 1. I see myself as a councillor for all Island Dam. I see myself as a councillor for all of Richmond County. So we're in this together. I said from the start, what's good for District 1 is good for Richmond County. And what's good for Richmond County is good for all districts.
You know, to explain that we went out and had consultations with the public and that 90% or 80% of the public definitely wants status quo with very, very minimum changes. And again, we will make a couple little changes to reflect the numbers a little better. It doesn't always come down to the numbers. So that's the argument we're going to use and we're going to send back to them. Again, anything else, they do have the right or the option to send it back and say no. Tweak it more, do more, change it.
We've heard that if there was turmoil and if there was an uproar, that these public consultations would be full. But people are saying no news is good news, I guess, right? So, and that's what we're gonna push. We're gonna push that.
Saturday's open house at Centre La Picasse in Petit de Grat didn't just discuss potential community division, it also discussed potential cultural division. Should Acadian communities be allowed to stay together within the 5-council system? Here's what one attendee at the January 15th session at Centre La Picasse had to say about that.
5 is you're there, in a sense that it's more effective representation, it's more minority, it's in there. The 5 that was proposed is, to me, is deleting the minority representation when you send it to Evanston and
Right.
and number 7, no, it doesn't work at all.
Right. Yeah. So as you said, when it comes to heritage and community heritage and
Heritage is more minority language.
Right. Yeah, that's what I think.
Some of the people feel that, you know, Lennox Bassett should have been part of Bluesdale. You know,
Down the then could be part of Bluesdale too.
correct. So I don't, you know, I don't disagree. All I could do when I knocked on their doors was tell them that I will give them the exact same representation as I do anybody else.
Just as important as culture and communities for councillors Samson and Diggdon, a united front among Richmond councillors when they make their final proposal to the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board.
In the discourse, at the discourse one, there was some of us there. There was one resident that said, you know, he said for him, it wasn't, you know, community division was a concern. And he said, you know, it's a concern for a lot of people, but he also said what he felt was more of a concern for him in the past, and he hoping that he never sees it goes that way again, was council division. And he said in the past, there was council division, you could see it, it was obvious. And he said, with the current council, it's obvious that there's no council division there. Everybody's working for the right reasons. And so, you know, that's, again, why fix what isn't broken.
You know, we have council separation, I guess. We all don't agree. It never goes all 5, yeas or nays, but we had one last week and I was the one nay. We had one the week before and somebody else was the nay. So again, you know, I think if we all sat in the same room and we were all yeses, then we'd have that same problem to we'd want to look at is, you know, why is council sitting together and always agreeing on whatever. That'll never happen. For me, I was happy to say no to these 2 proposals because I knew that people in my district definitely wouldn't want them changes. And it reflected, we had over 20-some people in Jammers Island, we probably had over 20-some people in the schools.
A recurring theme during the open house held at Centre La Picasse in Petit de Grat on Saturday, January the 21st, was the methodology and legitimacy of surveys taken in the run-up to the decisions on the boundaries for Richmond County. Specifically, councillors Diggdon and Samson had concerns with an online survey conducted by the municipality prior to January the 15th. Here's Councillor Diggdon to explain his thoughts.
You know, we had less than 1% fill out the survey. Again, we don't even know if they were electoral voters or not, but less than 1% did fill out the survey. Excuse me. And when you do that, you know, my job in my district is to represent them the best they can, the same as every other councillor. When I look at 1,300 electorals in my district, and less than 1% of the whole population voted, I'm not bringing that to the bank. So I'm going to make the best judgment call through a public consultation that I can. And again, when we reached out and had these, they were at status quo, definitely not 7, definitely not 5. So even though the 1% majority that did go online liked to 7, I don't believe they knew exactly how it was gonna break down, and they knew the cost, and they knew the expense, and they knew everything else about it.
But when it comes to important decisions like this, I think that it's very important to engage the public, engage the residents. I said from the start, the 106 was kind of, like Councillor Diggdon said, it's less than 1% of the population. We had, let's say 6 or 7, our councillor had one in Grand Anse and one in St. Peter's. We had one in Germantown, and Erin at the schools in here today. So we've had 6 or 7 open houses, consultations, and we probably had more or very close to the 106 that filled out that survey in a 7 or 8 month span. So, yeah, we're going to take into consideration these open houses and public consultations because we've had just as much involvement in here listening to you than what we had. And again, when it comes to the online survey, we don't know, are they voters, or are they, what district, all this stuff. At least here, we're talking with people verbally, and they're voicing their concerns and their questions.
What we're doing today probably should have been, and what we did in the last couple of weeks, probably should have been done a couple months ago before that survey. I also believe that, the survey should have been recorded in a way that I can't send in 2 or 3. Whether it's a voter number, whether it's a voter address, whether it's a phone number linked to it. Again, right now I could have sat down, or a week ago I could have sat down and filled out 10 surveys, all for 7 councillors, or all for 5, or leave it alone, or. So to me that was an issue, because we have 100 and some that filled it out, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't the same person who filled out 5 or 6.
I think in the future, that special meeting we had where we discussed it for 3 or 4 hours, what we do here, what we do there, I think that special meeting should have took place first. And we would have went to the consultant and said, I think this is the best case scenario for everybody in Richmond and all the councillors around the table to say, here's what you should put on the survey. And I think then you would have seen a lot more than 106, and you probably would have seen, when it was better explained, you probably would have seen, the true numbers, right? Which we're seeing today, because it went from the first and second survey, and this at 41, 42%, and I think had 5 at maybe 21%. So the first 2 surveys had proposed 7 really taking charge and hitting home for the preferred number. After our 3rd survey and after our public consultations and open houses, when the 3rd survey closed on Sunday, the number was in favor of status quo. 5, leave it the way it was. Because I think some people went home, filled out the survey after these consultations. People said, okay, I better understand what's going on here now. And I think status quo and 5 councillors is the way to go.
I look at the numbers, and I look at 130 people, I'd say between 120 and 150 filled out this. Again, we're less than 1% of all Richmond County. So that tells me that the rest of Richmond County is okay with the status quo. By holding these public consultations, then we get, like the residents of Germantown and the school truck debate, we get them to come out and say, no, we're not okay with them changes. So I already know that the people in my district, that the proposed changes aren't okay with that status quo. So,
right.
So as a rule of thumb, we look at, we sent out the survey, it was from 3 councillors to 10 councillors. So now I look at, well, from 5 councillors and up, the people are 80%
right.
satisfied.
I know you were here today. I know you were here, you volunteer field, right? And in the schools there was 22 people, and I think 20 out of the 22 said status quo. So that you can bank on. Those are facts. Hiding behind a keyboard and filling in 106 times, that's a question. This is not questionable, right? So for us, we're going to base a lot on this, right?
So now that you've heard some thoughts from District 1 Councillor Shawn Samson and District 2 Councillor Michael Diggdon, as well as some of their constituents on the question of how the municipal boundaries should shake out for Richmond County, let's return to the regular monthly meeting of Richmond Council on Monday, January 23rd. And we'll take you to the final discussions that took place before the vote on what proposal should go forward from Richmond County to the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board. A reminder, by the way, that Stantec Planning and Design, which helped come up with some of the proposals for the new boundaries, was on a call with Richmond Council during this meeting to stand by in case they needed to jump in. So you're going to hear some references to Stantec during the upcoming discussion. Let's take you back to the Richmond Municipal Building in Arishat for Monday evening's regular council session right now.
To get the two councillors in Almadam closer to the 12, minus 12%,
Right.
which is still not within parity, but it's like 2% off, it's so close, right? Instead of having 170 people from Arishat in District 2, I put 220 people in District 2. And I don't know what that would mean to the line, but I'm sure when you look at Almadam as a whole, there are other ways we could achieve that might
Yes.
Yeah,
make
so
more
instead
sense.
so instead of 170, you said 220, so
220.
that's 50. And the only way to do that is if you went from the New Horizon Senior Club to Highland Street and then Beanet's Lane or whatever, which is almost right in line with each other. You probably get, you're looking at Highland Street and you're looking at the foyer in Arishat. You're
Right.
probably looking at the 50, 60 voters right there. So my area, instead of New Horizon Senior Club, my area would stop at Beanet's Lane and Highland Street.
Right.
That would be probably the 50 or 60, and I know where you're going, because right now, Councillor Diggdon's at 1313. I'm at 1373, so that's 60 voters in the difference.
Exactly.
If
It
you're
puts
looking
you a
at-
little closer.
Right, so if you're looking at 2700 in total, if he had 50 extra, that would put me at whatever, and him at close to the exact same numbers,
Yeah.
right? So that would
And again,
Especially if Lennox Passage would be returned to
Right,
District 3.
Right.
Then it would be actually exactly the same.
Right,
right.
and those two lanes are almost like, you're going up this lane and you're making a little bit of a left and going up Island Street, it's
Yeah.
almost like parallel with each other, right? So that change could work.
And again, that suggestion for Madame, recognizing that I'm not a counselor here, and I
Yeah.
would definitely defer to your connections and expertise here. My suggestion also was, because when we take Lennox Passage out of District 3, it does throw that district out of parity. My suggestion was to look at moving St. George's Channel over to District 4, but I do completely take your points, Councillor Melanie, and I would be supportive of either or, and I know, when I think about it on a personal level, I would absolutely jump at the chance to represent that community, but I also understand it's not about my personal love for the breakfasts at St. George's Channel Hall.
We can both still go.
We can both still go, which we did last time.
Yes.
So, it's a bigger issue than that. So I'm not opposed to either one, but I did recognize that moving St. George's Channel from District 3 to District 4 would return your district to parity at about 9% over the average. But then, of course, it puts District 4 over the average, and then, my feeling is that that's okay, because the rationale there is that there is in that district a population density within the St. Peter's area that, you can service a lot of people in a much shorter amount of time, to the deputy warden's point, where it's not covering 50% of the geography of the county. So my feeling is that District 5 should be a little bit less, because of that incredible distance that a councillor there has to travel compared to the other areas. So my feeling is we would fix the issue with the few voters on Grande-Greve Road to put them in District 4. Originally, that was my thinking, but if we left St. George's Channel in District 3, which I think presents there's a really good argument for that, then I guess I would suggest putting all of Grande-Greve into District 4 from District 5. It would put that district at about 14% over parity, but it would give District 5 about a minus 1.4%, and again, to the deputy warden's point that it's such an incredibly large territory to cover. The suggestion I'm making then at this point would be basically, 4 of the 5 districts are slightly out of parity, but no one is completely out of whack. We're still within numbers, within a couple hundred voters of each other per district, so.
I kind of said from the beginning, and we have to sort of exclude ourselves from these
Exactly.
conversations to an extent, because I said,
Yeah.
in all honesty, I liked the idea of 7 originally, but I also like the district as it is, and I think we probably all feel that to an extent about liking the districts as they are. But, it's to think of somebody in the future
right.
covering that
Exactly.
geographic area, it can be a deterrent
Yeah.
for people. So, and that's, even though it's a small addition, that's where I'd be fine with that, not adding to it,
Right.
Yeah.
We would probably need to have a special council meeting, maybe that first week of February, and make sure that we develop our strong rationale, and I just want to recognize, that there's a member of the public here who was good enough to come and attend one of the sessions, and that was your comment, so we need to make sure that we have a strong rationale for what we put forward. So would councillors generally be okay with that process?
Yeah.
In the years when the plus or minus was 33%, people were pushing the limits. When it was 25%, they were at or over the limits, but they were still approved because they had strong rationale. So I think that, officially the limit is like the plus or minus 25. The UARB is really saying, what they really want is 10%. So yes, we're going a bit over those like recommended, we're between the 10 and 25, but with strong rationale. And I think anybody who would look at a map and see the way we were trying to do a 5-district to be within parity, that, our rationale to keep the communities together is strong. I think the fact that we did have such a huge change 8 years ago, I think will hold some weight. But I think to the warden's point, it's really, we can ask John's opinion, of course, but it is his opinion.
And as you mentioned, Councillor Melanie, I mean, keeping the communities together is a strong argument, and I'm sure that that's going to be looked into and considered strongly. But like you said, it's not like we're all at minus 24 or plus 24.
Right.
Or
That's
25.
And in the past,
We're at
that was
11.
the strong argument,
Right, yes,
Like it
exactly.
specifically said, at that time, the argument was to
Right.
keep the communities together, to blah, blah, blah. Like, all of the arguments that we're talking about making are all the ones that in the past, when
Were accepted.
councils have put forth recommendations that have been outside of the ranges, were found to be acceptable by the UARB, right? And I
Yeah.
recognize that,
Yeah.
of course, boards, like everything else, change from year to year, and
Yeah.
this board may determine that they really want to stay within that. And if they do, we have to recognize that when we're presenting something
Right.
that's not sort of what they've said they'd like to see, that they could come back with something different. But we need to do what we think is right for
Yeah.
our county and for
Yeah.
the residents of the county. And
Exactly.
I think that's what we're talking about doing.
No,
So-
for sure, yeah. And what makes me feel comfortable and gives me confidence is that, again, like I said, it's not like we're all at minus 24,
Right.
minus 25.
Yeah.
And we got to sell this.
Yeah.
We're all at maybe minus 11, minus 12, or plus, so
Very
we're,
close.
we're very close, and we're pushing
Yeah.
that agenda, right? So
Yeah.
I think we should be okay,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
And the 2% variance is like how
Right.
many people, like it's,
Right.
you know what I mean? Every percent variance is not very many people,
right.
so it's not a lot of a difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a comment that in the old days, maybe it would have been like, okay, we're just gonna put it out there, and then it's gonna be, 4 against 1 or 2 against 3, or whatever the case may be. And I really like this process where we're trying to kind of have a discussion and be a little more collaborative about it. So I think that's a sign of the modernization of councils in general, and I'm really, really pleased with how this is going. It's, we're not all coming out with what we thought, but
No.
that's what
That's what it's
that's
all
what
about.
negotiation is,
Yep,
right?
I
So-
totally agree, Madam Warden. I mean, like the
Yeah.
resident in question said, you're not talking only about community parity, you're talking about council parity here,
Yeah.
right? So it's good to see, and I think
Yeah.
it's a great process, right? So
Yeah.
it's good.
Okay, so at this point then, I'm gonna ask for a motion to have the warden and CAO work with Stantec on a new map that would include the following changes. It would be to add Lennox Passage District 3, explore a more equitable division on Almadam between the councillors, to move Grande-Greve to District 4, and to fix the issue to move the voters in Thibaultville to return them to District 4 as well.
And with that, all 5 Richmond Municipal Councillors in attendance at Monday's regular meeting voted unanimously in favor of the current 5-district setup for Richmond Council, with the changes and revisions just underlined by Warden Amanda Mumbercat a moment ago. Council is now trying to set a follow-up date for a special council meeting to be held within the next week and a half to finalize the details of their municipal boundary proposal to the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board before the board's extended deadline for the municipal boundary review for Richmond County expires on February the 15th. Telile Community Television will provide more details of the boundary review as they become available. Stay tuned to Roundtable and Telile 24/7. We have just a few minutes left on this week's edition of Telile's Roundtable, so we're going to go into Port Hawkesbury to share some highlights from recent developments that took place at Port Hawkesbury Town Council. These happened at a combined meeting of Port Hawkesbury's regular council session and the Committee of the Whole meeting for council, and they took place on January the 17th at the Port Hawkesbury Civic Centre Shannon Studio. During that meeting, the town's Director of Finance, Erin MacEachen, warned that while assessments are on their way up in Port Hawkesbury, both on the residential and commercial side, they're heading up at a sluggish pace that may not allow the town to gain a lot of revenue from that in the months to come. Here's Erin MacEachen to explain how the assessment picture looks in Port Hawkesbury right now.
So we did get our new 2023 roll, assessment roll, which comes out in December, which will be reflected in our upcoming budget season, so for our 2023-24 fiscal year. So I'm sure you've read, I guess our historical trends have been decline in assessment, but this year we're seeing some growth, which is consistent with the national trend and obviously provincial trend, and I'm sure you've seen some information on that in the news, and you've probably been hearing from constituents maybe about questions about their assessments. So just to give you kind of some history on our trends. So this is the first year we've seen some more significant growth, I guess, in our residential and commercial assessments. So over the last 10 years, so a 10-year growth in our residential assessment is 15%. So on average about 1.5% per year, but we're seeing that primarily in the last couple of years. So assessment growth over 10 years has been nominal, but we have seen the majority of that growth in the last couple of years, and in particular this year. Commercial growth, we have seen, what's positive is that we have seen a substantial 1-year increase in our commercial assessment, but again, if you compare it back to where we were at in 2014, we're still 1% lower in assessment for commercial than we were in 2014. So no real pickup there. We're just basically getting back to where we were in that year. Resource, which is a very small portion of our assessment, but we've seen a decline of 16% in that assessment. So just graphically on the next slide, you'll see the growth presented. So basically you're seeing our commercial kind of coming back to where it was at the 2014 level. On the bottom graph, you're seeing basically flat growth in our residential assessment with a slight increase in last fiscal year and a healthy increase, I'd say, in the current year, or the upcoming budget year. So what that means around revenue, which is how I like to equate assessment. So we're seeing an 8.8% increase in our residential assessment over last year, which equates to close to $240,000 in new revenue. Commercial, we're seeing a 7% increase in year-over-year assessment, which equates to about $150,000. Resource, small decline over last year, but overall just under $400,000 in revenue growth from increased assessments. I think you may have seen, and on the next slide you'll see the Cape Breton assessment trends, and we're at the bottom of the growth in Cape Breton, probably consistent with the province, but we're still happy with an increase versus a decrease. Which is a kind of a good news story for us from a budget perspective. But again, you'll see Inverness County was the leader with a 15% increase. Now, this is an average assessment increase, so the numbers I reported were on specific assessments, so residential, commercial. This number here is an average assessment of all of the assessments together, so that includes your exempt properties as well. So that's where PBSC would have, these numbers came from a news article in CBC. And just, again, nice to see some growth. Maybe the next slide there, Terry, if you don't mind. Really, it's positive, but again, we just have to kind of keep in mind that these are based on 2021 sales values. That's PBSC uses a year behind, I guess, when they're looking at sales. So they're analyzing those sales and comparing that to your community, and then determining what the market increase is in your communities. So we know that the market has cooled in 2022, so this should impact our upcoming annual assessments, because property sales, I think, reported through MLS were about 15% lower in 2022 than they were in 2021. So that will impact future years or next year's roll. And just to bring to your attention that last year we did balance our budget, but that was based on taking $155,000 from reserve. So close to half of the revenue growth from this year's assessment growth is already committed if we maintain those expenses. And obviously there's typically increases in expenses when we look at power, when we look at education, when we look at policing, all our large significant expenses. This growth is not specific to town of Port Hawkesbury alone. It's a provincial, national trend. We should be encouraged, I think, in the growth in commercial assessments. That's kind of where it's been on the decline for so long here. That 1 year kind of significant pickup is something that I'm encouraged by, and I think we should be encouraged by, and hopefully we'll continue to see that in future assessment roles. But and again, obviously, I'm sure, and as you can tell your constituents, there's an appeal process with PVSC. You can appeal. There's a form on the back of your assessment notice. We could see, based on individuals maybe not as encouraged by the growth in their assessments as we may be. There will be an appeal process, and we will understand the number of accounts and the value of accounts probably in end of February.
Most of you probably know that the Mi'kmaq flag flies outside the Richmond Municipal Building in Arishat. Well, Port Hawkesbury Town councillors are having a discussion on whether the same thing should happen permanently at the Port Hawkesbury Civic Centre. Here's Mayor Brenda Chisholm-Beaton speaking to reporters following last week's regular meeting and Committee of the Whole to talk about how Town Council could be looking at installing a fourth flagpole to allow for permanent recognition of Mi'kmaq and their community here in Cape Breton.
I think that is important for us to learn more about our very diverse province and the very diverse history that we have here as a province, and acknowledge and celebrate all of the distinct cultures and heritages that we have, including our Black, African, Canadian communities. So we as a council are very proud to raise the flag for African Heritage Month. Similarly for Mi'kmaq History Month and the other Mi'kmaq events that we'd like to celebrate. And it was mentioned also in the council meeting that we have had a commitment from council last year to install a fourth flagpole, because we definitely want to continue to work with our Unama'ki community members and neighbors, with our neighboring Buckingham community as well, to make a commitment around truth and reconciliation. And part of that is like taking that extra step. So the commitment from council to install that fourth flagpole and fly the Mi'kmaq flag permanently, so that it's not just going to be incrementally at specific times of the year. It's critically important that we show that commitment by having the flag flying permanently in the town of Port Hawkesbury.
And there you have it. That wraps up this week's edition of Roundtable here on Telile Community Television. Thank you for tuning in, and a special thank you to my Telile colleagues Becky, Bourinot, Nick Boudreau, and Callen Cowan for filming and formatting the footage from Richmond Municipal Council's regular meeting on Monday, January the 23rd. If you have any thoughts or comments about what you've seen over the past hour on Roundtable, or you'd just like to make suggestions for a future show, feel free to contact me directly or to contact Telile Community Television in Arishat. And be sure to follow Telile on social media. For now, I'm Adam Cook. Thank you for joining me for this special edition of Roundtable. I look forward to seeing you again next time with a brand new show. Bye for now.